Thanks, Al. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you just
Perfect.
fine.
Thank you. And thank you all for taking the time to be here with us today. Also, once again, thank you, Al and Drew, for coordinating with me over the last couple of months and getting me on the calendar to present today. My name is Joel Osuna-Williams, and I'm a project manager at the Center for Geospatial Science and Technology out of California State University, Northridge. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about a collaborative project that we completed not too long ago with the U.S. Forest Service Southwestern Region, that's USFS Region 3, to bring comprehensive updates to the National Hydrography dataset. We worked with them to update the NHD within their forests, most of their forests in their region, and we'll be talking about that and some of the details that went into that work today. So before we get started, I wanted to briefly provide some background information about my center and what we do and how we work with other agencies and institutions. We've been around for over 15 years, and like I mentioned, we operate out of CSU Northridge in Southern California. We're a nonprofit organization, and we provide professional GIS services and other related services through the different collaborations that we establish. We work with agencies and groups at the federal, state, and local level, in addition to working with nonprofits, community organizations, and private firms as well. We have an established core team of GIS professionals, and since we're embedded in the university, the team also includes faculty of different backgrounds and areas of expertise and study that often either help directly on a project or available to consult and provide some support. One of our keystone objectives is to provide students and recent graduates technical and professional experience opportunities through the work and the projects that we bring in. That's one of our keystone objectives, since we are embedded in academia within the university. We also partner with other centers and groups at other universities, specifically other CSUs in the California system. One great example is our ongoing partnership with the Geographical Information Center. We're partnered with them to do lots and lots of ongoing NHD work in California. I'll talk a little bit about some of that in just a minute. But there are other centers across other universities that are set up very similar to us, again, focusing on giving students learning and professional technical growth and work experience. So it's always really great to use that synergy and partner with other universities. So this setup really benefits everyone involved, be it the university growing institutional knowledge through the work that we bring in, students, being able to gain applied real-world work experience from the work that they're helping out with on the different projects, and also our partners, our external partners receiving professional services that end up supporting the university and its students. So in the end, partnerships like the one I'm going to talk about today end up really being a win-win for everyone involved. So I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about our center's activities within the NHD world, and how our prior activities kind of help pave the way to our eventual collaboration with the U.S. Forest Service. So back in the day, this was several years ago, our two USGS liaisons, Drew Decker and Carol Ostergren, were really trying to pave the way to get the ball rolling with when it comes to stewardship in California, bringing NHD updates and maintaining the NHD in the state. They were able to acquire some funding, and we were able to form a co-op agreement with them to do some pilot exploration work within the state of California. At that time, there was no steward, there was no official organized effort, at the steward or sub-steward level to bring updates to the NHD. There were pockets of work being done here and there, but it was by no means organized. It was very sporadic here and there, and again lacked a lot of the organization. So in this pilot effort, what we ended up doing is we set up an agreement with USGS, and we ended up updating 6 watersheds in the state of California, plus one partial watershed. And the main objective was obviously to bring NHD, comprehensive NHD updates, which means we didn't really piecemeal the work. We didn't just look at, for example, just streams. We looked at streams and ponds and reservoirs and washes and canals, you name it. We try to assess it all and provide comprehensive updates, bring the NHD up to current standards at the time. So that was one of the big driving factors. Is a lot of key portions of the state really needed to be updated. So that was one of the big takeaways of that pilot project. But in addition to that, we also wanted to really hit the exploration and the needs assessment really hard, just because, again, there was no coordinated stewardship effort in the state at that time. So in doing the work, we also collected information, data about what resources were needed to put staff through training and then eventually onto the production NHD update work. What were time and cost requirements for bringing comprehensive updates to the different areas that we updated, just so that we can take what we learned and document that and then potentially apply that to future work. The whole goal of this project, like many pilot projects, is to kind of set a pathway to bigger and broader efforts. And so that ended up being really successful. We ended up growing that project and in cooperation with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and then our partners up at CSU Chico, up at the Geographical Information Center, we were able to get the ball rolling and establish a new agreement in which we brought additional comprehensive updates to key watersheds where Department of Fish and Wildlife was carrying out a lot of their critical work. They do a lot of work in fisheries and fish habitat studies. So they identified key areas in California that needed to have an updated NHD. And so that wasn't able to cover all the states. So it wasn't a statewide update, but it was a huge step up from that small pilot project. So we were able to do that successfully. And in doing so, we also started to develop and really refine our California-specific business rules. These are mapping and interpretation rules for updating the NHD. Between GIC and our center, we had potentially, a couple dozen editors working on the NHD, bringing updates. So we wanted to make sure we aimed for a certain level of consistency. And we really took a look at California as a whole and what the needs are for the hydrography within the state. So we ended up developing this living, breathing document that we call the California Mapping Business Rules. And that project with Department of Fish and Wildlife was really the precursor to official California stewardship, which is currently ongoing and is being directed by California Department of Water Resources. Jean Schaefer-Kramer is leading that. And we are also working with her. Again, we've kind of been piggybacking off along this effort, helping to lead the way and usher the way through this work. So we're currently working with her, and you could see the current status map. I think that was as of the end of June of this year. We're really close to completing and realizing a statewide update effort. So we're really heavily involved in California, bringing updates to the NHD and have been for many, many years. So you're probably wondering, what does the California work have anything to do with the work that we did for USFS in Arizona and New Mexico? Back when we were just in the first couple years of bringing NHD updates through that initial pilot project, we also, again, with the help of our USGS liaisons, Drew Decker and Carol Ostergren, we were able to get in contact with the Desert Landscape Conservation Cooperative, that's the DLCC. And we were able to establish a cost share agreement where everybody provided some funding and set up a new project where we were going to go in and bring comprehensive updates to key areas where the DLCC was conducting their research and their studies. And they primarily do work in climate change, habitat assessments, things like that. And they were primarily working within southeastern Arizona. So keep that in mind. I'm going to circle back to this because this Arizona project really paved the way and allowed us to get in contact with USFS and get the ball rolling with USFS. And I'm going to circle back to that in a few minutes and talk about what areas in Arizona we updated and how they were so closely related to the U.S. forests in Arizona and New Mexico. So a little bit of background on the USFS Region 3, again, the Southwestern region. Their area or their region covers the states of Arizona, New Mexico, and then they have a couple national grasslands that are within their jurisdiction. Those are located in northern Texas and eastern Oklahoma. So USFS carried out several years ago a needs assessment that aimed at identifying the uses of NHD, how their own personnel use NHD. And then in addition to that, they wanted to identify the needs for an updated NHD. What specific components of the NHD needed to be updated? What components were more important to update than others for their own uses and their work? So like I mentioned before, or I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but they are mandated as a federal agency to use the NHD for most of their work and research that requires hydrographic data, whether for reference or for use as, as an actual, data source for research and conducting research. They are federally mandated to use the NHD. And examples of this include, uses for aquatic surveys and those very important and popular fire retardant maps that everybody talks about when it comes to USFS and fire management. So it's kind of a given then that if they're federally mandated to use the NHD, it's critical that the NHD be updated and be as accurate as possible in order to ensure effective work to be conducted, effective and accurate work to be conducted. So in their needs assessment work, they conducted this on a forest by forest basis, and you can see a summary table there on the right side of the slide there. And they identified the different NHD needs or the different NHD issues across all the different forests within their region. And essentially what they tried to do is they tried to weigh what components of the NHD were more important than others across the entire region. So the three issues that kind of bubbled up to the surface as being the most important were stream seasonality attribution. So that's making sure that the F-code, F-type attribution was as accurate as can be, especially with streams. So again, that's the perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral seasonality attribution. Having that be accurate was very critical to their work. In addition to that, a complete hydrographic representation, completeness standard was number 2, and then tied with number 2, item number 3 there was having names, their local and regional names, be somehow associated and present alongside the NHD was also something that was deemed to be fairly important. And so the USFS determined that if they were going to conduct some degree of improvement work to the NHD, they were only going to be able to carry out a portion of that work. They weren't going to be able to knock off everything from this list, like the 10 most important components that you see up there. So they determined that they were only going to, given the resources they had available at the time, they were only going to be able to tackle the seasonality attribution and the naming component. And that's, again, assuming that they would use the resources they had available themselves. They determined that correcting erroneous hydrography and making it complete and applying standards for consistency across the board for all their forests within their region was just going to be too costly for them to carry out by themselves with the resources they had available. So I'd like for all of you to keep this in mind, keep this chart in mind, again, the fact that they were potentially going to just tackle 2 issues. And I'm going to circle back to this towards the end of the presentation when I provide a summary of what we were able to complete for them, because we were able to take the resources that they had available and really take it beyond what their original scope was or what they were intending to do themselves. So we will circle back to this in a few minutes. So hitting the rewind button once here and going back to that desert landscape conservation cooperative project. This is, again, that project I mentioned where we updated some watersheds for the DLCC in Arizona. We updated 5 watersheds in southeastern Arizona. You could see them there in the blue, and 1 watershed that falls along the California-Arizona border, has the Colorado River running through it there. You'll notice here the big glaring thing that pops out here is in southeastern Arizona, these blue watersheds are immediately adjacent to U.S. Forest Service lands. So there's forests that are scattered all over here in this area and that are immediately neighbors to the areas, the watersheds that we updated. And for the DLCC project, we did not update the NHD within USFS lands, even though some of these watersheds do overlap U.S. forest jurisdictions. We understood the importance of having USFS involved and giving them a say in how their NHD gets updated. So because the scope was pretty limited for this project, we did not include any of those green areas that you see up there on the map. So we only updated the areas in blue, the neighboring areas. But the areas, the land cover types, the composition, the hydrography characteristics within these areas that we updated are very, very similar to the adjacent areas that slip into the U.S. Forest Service lands. So a lot of the business rules, for example, the mapping and interpretation rules that we developed in these different watersheds that we updated are applicable to the USFS lands because, again, the composition, the makeup, the hydrographic makeup of these areas are so similar. And if you think about it in a broader perspective, you don't want the NHD, just because it crosses a jurisdictional boundary, to necessarily be mapped at a different scale or in a very different way, interpreted in a different way, because then you'll have this, patchwork quilt that will be just very different with a lot of inconsistencies across the board. So ideally, the business rules that we set up in these areas that we updated for the DLCC should have been applied to the USFS at some point down the road. And again, this is all a preface to the work that we ended up doing for the USFS. So speaking of which, after we completed that project for the Desert Landscape Conservation Cooperative, we were able to do a couple presentations to summarize, the work completed and some of the nuances of the work, some of the specifics of the work. And we essentially demonstrated that comprehensive updates in the arid Southwest can be done to the NHD in a cost-effective manner, and we started to develop some of the standards and tackling some of the specifics given the arid region that we updated there. So luckily for us, we were able to have some USFS folks on some of those presentations, and they were interested in learning a little bit more from us in terms of what we did. And the timing worked out perfectly because, again, they had just completed their needs assessment and they were trying to make decisions as to how to move forward in updating the NHD within their forests. And then they hear about us. So again, the timing was really, really good. There was a lot of potential synergy, a lot of efficiencies there. We already had a trained NHD production team of editors, and again, we had business rules in place. So it's almost like we were ready to go and really set up to just move from this DLCC project into the USFS agreement that we eventually set up. So we had some back and forth with them and eventually set up a mutual interest agreement with them, with the idea that we would take what we did for the DLCC project, use that as kind of the basis, the foundation, and on top of that, build up some specifics that would tackle some of the forest's needs, right? So some examples of this are just building up some of the business rules to tackle some of their needs. They also wanted to get buy-in from their hydrologists and their GIS analysts, really the end users, the folks that were going to use the NHD after this update work was to be completed. They really wanted to get buy-in and have them be confident in the data that we were going to produce for them, the data that we were going to update for them. So they really pushed for some kind of data review by their forest specialists, and that's something that we ended up programming into the workflow, and I'll talk about that in a minute or so. And then one really unique part about this is that they were able to provide just a wealth of local data that they had on hand in addition to resource photography. We primarily use the NAPE aerial imagery to bring updates to the NHD, just because it is usually a data source that is fairly updated, and also provides coverage for most of the areas that we're updating. But the resource photography that they were providing was higher resolution, and then also in some cases was of much more use than the NAPE aerial photos that we were using. So you can kind of see here a lot of synergy, and this collaboration really grew out of a lot of the work that we were already doing, taking advantage of all those efficiencies that were already building up. So here's another reference map of the region, just to give you a better sense of the different forests and kind of the spatial layout of the different forests. Again, covering Arizona, New Mexico, and then parts of Oklahoma and Texas. For the project, we ended up updating all the forests that are called out, minus the Gila National Forest. If I remember correctly, the Gila National Forest had recently received updates from their local GIS analysts there right before the project got started. So that forest was excluded. However, all the other forests and the national grasslands that fall under the jurisdiction of Region 3 were comprehensively updated for the project. So a little bit about the scope and some of the work specifics. Earlier on, we were trying to decide what resolution they would like the updates to occur at, and what accuracy scale we should aim for the NHD updates across all the different forests within the region. And the U.S. Forest Service did obviously indicate that something of a local resolution would be wonderful. However, the local resolution work was deemed to be too costly given the resources that were available, and they were really pushing to get an update carried out for all forests and not just selecting a couple forests and updating those. So they really wanted to get an update done across all forests. So really they acknowledged the fact that this could be done in a phased approach. We also talked about LiDAR availability, and from what I remember, there was very limited LiDAR available at the time. So that was not necessarily a feasible option at the time. So what we decided to go with was matching the native scale of the high resolution NHD. So our accuracy scale for the project for all the forests was set to 1 to 24K. And of course, we assessed the data and edited the data at much finer scales so that we could achieve that accuracy at 1 to 24K. But again, at the end of the day, the goal of the overall project was to achieve accuracy at that 1 to 24K scale. And of course, because we are working with NHD production, as many of you hopefully are familiar with, we ended up using kind of the standard workflow for updating the NHD, using the stewardship system, the hydro maintenance portal for checkouts, using the NHD update tools for editing and quality control, so on and so forth. Pretty standard there. And I had mentioned our business rules for mapping and interpretation, especially interpretation of arid features, ephemeral streams and washes in this desert and arid landscape. And the goal there was to aim for consistency, or as much consistency as possible, not only within any given forest, but across the different forests, and then also taking the work that we did for the DLCC in consideration so that, again, we don't end up with that patchwork quilt, right? We have consistency across the board. Now, about the USFS-specific requirements. So I had mentioned that they provided us with a bunch of reference data. Some of that was hydrographic reference data, which we use as a secondary source to kind of help with the decision-making when bringing updates to the NHD. And in addition to that, they were also able to provide us with this really cool data set that they had on hand. If I remember correctly, they had produced it themselves. This was a data set of riparian vegetation that really mapped riparian corridors. And this helped to further develop our seasonality determination business rules. So trying to determine if a channel, if a stream is ephemeral on the drier side, or if it's somewhere in the middle, something that's intermittent, or if it's of the wettest category, something that is perennial. With the cooperation of their hydrologists, we ended up refining our business rules for helping to make the seasonality determination a little bit more logically consistent. And it was a huge step up from what we normally do, just looking at different characteristics, vegetation type and texture, soil types, landscape characteristics that we use primarily off of the aerial photos to help us determine seasonality. They introduced this RMAP, this riparian vegetation data set, that allowed us to create a rule set that basically stated, things like if a stream like the one that you see here on the image, if a stream is within a riparian corridor, and that stream in the NHD is inherently classified as ephemeral, again, the driest category, it should be upgraded to intermittent. In other words, it's much more likely for a stream to be intermittent if it has a riparian vegetation on its banks for a pretty good extent there, rather than it being on the drier side. So that again helped us to refine those rules and make the data a little bit more reflecting of what they know in terms of their local knowledge and their expertise. They're, again, the quote unquote boots on the ground, so they know what their water systems look like, and that helped to translate some of the decision making that we did on the work. I had mentioned that naming was another important component. So we did end up rolling in a naming component to this work, or into this work. During the time we were editing, the USGS had a provisional naming tool, which was, it had a couple different goals. It meant one of the goals was to provide an efficient way to associate local and regional names to NHD features. And it also had another objective to potentially fast track the approval process for names, so that local names could be approved by GNIS, and there could be like an official GNIS name and an ID generated, and then later on they could be associated with the NHD. That tool was released in beta release, or in a beta form, and we were one of the few groups that were able to pilot test that tool. And we were able to associate many of the local names. They had just tons and tons of names in their local data that they use for reference and for reporting purposes, for cartographic purposes. And there was a huge importance to have those names associated with the updated NHD that we were producing for them. So we ended up leveraging that beta version of the provisional name tool as provided by USGS. Unfortunately, about midway through the project, the tool was decommissioned, so we had to come up with a workaround that essentially simulated what that tool accomplished. And really what we wanted to do is just provide a deliverable that USFS could utilize that allowed them to somehow tie these local names and associate them to the different features in the NHD, in the updated NHD. So what we did in this workaround is we developed a workflow and a mechanism that essentially created and populated an add-on table that had a permanent identifier field that was pulled from the NHD feature that was to receive a name, and then associated what we were calling a provisional name. So these were the local names coming from their data set. And essentially we produced and compiled this add-on table, and that table then was given to them as a deliverable, and then they could use that using the permanent identifier as a primary key, perform a tabular join, and that essentially brings those local names and associates them to the live version, the production version of the NHD. And again, that's just for the purposes of their internal use, again, for their reference, for their cartographic use, so on and so forth. There was interest in potentially discussing getting those names potentially reviewed and approved as official GNIS names. However, due to the limited resources available, and given all the other work that was going on at the time, that was kind of given a lesser priority. The bigger priority was to give them some kind of immediate deliverable that they could at the very least use internally at the conclusion of the project. So that was kind of where the scope kind of landed for that effort. And I'll provide a summary of how many names were assigned in just a minute. And then the local forest review, which I actually will talk about on this slide with the workflow overview. So if any of you are NHD editors, you're probably very familiar with the general NHD production workflow process. So we check out NHD data from the hydro maintenance portal, and then we carry out the bulk of the work. This is where initial QC is carried out, the NHD editing is carried out. This is where we stuck in the naming and then our different internal QC steps, again, checking for things like business rule compliance and and other unique USFS rule compliance checks. After all the editing is done and all the QC is done, normally we run final QC using the NHD tools, and then we get the data checked back in to the national data set, which then makes it available for download and public use through the various means that the NHD is available through. So the unique part about this workflow, so again, what you're seeing up here is just kind of the standard workflow for NHD work. But in addition to this, one of the unique aspects, like I mentioned before, is we had a lot of reference data provided by the Forest Service that we were able to use for the editing purposes and the QC checks. And then in addition to that, I had mentioned that it was super important for the hydrologists at the different forests and the GIS analysts at the regional forests to have an opportunity to review the data before the data was was signed off and turned in and all completed. So we developed a mechanism for them to review the data. So essentially we would finish up the editing, we'd finish up most of the QC, and what we would do is package up the data, provide a copy of the production data to them before checking it in, and also provided them with a mini workflow where they would be able to mark up the data and produce comments essentially for us, get their feedback, get their local knowledge embedded in this in this feedback layer that we produced, and have them submit that local feedback to us so that we can then roll that back into our QC steps, take a look at what their comments were, implement additional changes on top of what we already did, kind of refining our work, integrating their local feedback, their local knowledge, and then after that, moving on to final QC and then getting the data checked in. And this again goes back to the confidence building, making sure that the end users of the data were going to be confident in the product that was being created for them, giving them a say in an ability to review the work before the work was all said and done. So some summary results and outcomes. We did a lot of work in feature densification, that is adding new features into the NHD that were not already represented in the NHD. So here you see a before example, and this is a quick after example here. So adding a bunch of streams, this is a huge component. There was tons and tons of streams, especially ephemeral streams. I mean, we're talking about arid, semi-mountainous and mountainous areas here. So there was just tons and tons of streams that needed to be added to the NHD and represented in the NHD that never were there to begin with. So we added a lot of those into the NHD, adding springs, adding what they call tanks, which are small ponds and reservoirs for irrigation and other human uses. There was tons of tiny, tiny little ponds that we ended up adding into there. And again, using their reference data to help locate those and then cross-checking those against the latest aerial photos for accuracy. Of course, there were features already in the NHD. Many of those were outdated in terms of their geography. So there was reshaping, realignment, extensions that needed to occur, and then also attribution updates as well. You'll see here that there's different color codes for the different seasonality types of the different streams that you see here. Yellow is ephemeral, it's the driest category. The light blue are intermittent, and then the darker, thicker blue lines are the perennial rivers. So there was a lot of seasonality classification and attribution that was incorrect, and improving the attribution, improving the names, and then the seasonality using their local feedback resulted in a much more improved and more updated NHD, again, that reflected their local knowledge, especially coming up with the seasonality determination. We got just a wealth of knowledge coming from the local forest reviewers, letting us know, hey, this is actually not intermittent. I've been there, it's ephemeral, and getting that knowledge and transferring it into the NHD. Here's a quick table summary of the work that was completed. So we updated a total of 10 forests across the entire region, across 3 different phases. So the work was done, I think, in a little over 2 years, and it was divided up into 3 different phases. Every forest obviously being slightly different size. And you can see there, the main highlight of this table on the far right column is the number of comments that we got from that local forest review mechanism that we programmed into the workflow. And that was hugely successful. You could see here we got, in some cases, thousands of comments from their review. And again, we were able to get on phone calls, get on conference calls, have a back and forth with them, have a dialogue with them, let them know, hey, this is what you guys should be prioritizing. This is what we need the most help with, the most input on. And they were able to do this in a very structured and controlled way that was really very beneficial and hugely insightful. And again, collecting that local knowledge. In some cases, we received, like I said, thousands of comments. A lot of these comments were seasonality comments, again, just letting us know this needs to be changed from ephemeral to intermittent, or intermittent and downgraded to ephemeral, things like that. But in addition to that, they caught other things that that weren't necessarily obvious to us, very specialized features that were, or complexes that were important to them that needed to be reflected in the NHD. So there was just an abundance of feedback and review that was done across all the different forests. I'm going to show a quick set of diagrams here of graphs just showing off the different levels of densification. So what you're seeing here is the densification of ephemeral flow lines calculated in length in miles across the different forests. So you see the lighter color bars are the before counts, and then the darker bars are the after counts. And you can see in some cases, we doubled the amount of ephemeral mileage in some forests, like the Cibola National Forest, ended up, I think, tripling in size in terms of the amount of stream mileage for the ephemeral classification. So there was just a ton of mileage that was added, especially in the ephemeral classification, due to the nature of the landscape. Here's the same scenario, but this is for intermittent flow lines. Again, flow lines that are of the intermittent seasonality classification there. And in some cases, the count actually went down, and that doesn't necessarily indicate a deletion, such as the case with the Cibola National Forest. It could have also indicated a change or a downgrade from the intermittent classification over to the drier classification, the ephemeral classification. But in some cases, too, you just see an explosion in the intermittent flow lines, like in the Santa Fe National Forest. And again, this is with the guidance of their hydrologists and their local knowledge. Some of these forests you should also be aware are at higher elevations. So the likelihood of wetter complexes and wetter hydrography is more prevalent in those higher elevation forests as well, which kind of played a factor in the rules and the feedback that we got. And then the third scenario here, the wettest classification. This is the perennial classification. This is, I think, the one that received the most downgrades, just because I feel, from what I remember, a lot of perennial streams were downgraded down to either intermittent or the ephemeral classification. So there's not a lot of change, and most of the changes here were a decrease in total length in miles. And again, not due to deletion, but due to a conversion or a downgrade to a lesser category, a category that's less wet. This is a summary of the spring integration that we did. We added tons of springs. You can see here across the different forests. Down here, our total number of springs that were added to the NHD was over 1,200 here, leading to a total of 6,700 or so springs across all the different forests. So we ended up adding over 1,000 springs using a couple different reference data sets. We used the Springs Stewardship Institute data set primarily, and then we also had some springs present in the local forest data that we looked at and integrated in there. So a huge jump in the number of springs and spring representation across the different forests. This is a summary table for the naming that was done, the names that were associated to the NHD through the kind of the workflow and the mechanism that I described earlier. As a total here, we ended up adding almost 4,000 local names to the NHD, and this is across the entire region. That's just a ton of names that were associated and rolled into a deliverable that USFS is now using. Again, they could just enable that tabular join and bring those names in. And I should also note we did do the naming across the polygon, flow lines, and point feature classes as well. So we had like a lot of spring names, we had stream names, and then in the polygon features, lakes and those tanks that I mentioned, those smaller ponds. just a lot of names that were within the local reference data sets that are now associated with NHD. So I mentioned before that we were going to circle back to this table. So here's this table again, and if you all remember, if USFS, if they were going to plan on using their own resources and they were going to do the work themselves, they had planned to do item 1, the improvement of the stream type attribution, and item 3. We were able to actually complete way more than that. We were able to tackle items 1 through 4, so the stream type attribution, the completeness standard, again, enforcing business rules for consistency and making sure that the data was updated comprehensively. We tackled the naming component. We were able to bring in the point integration or the springs into the data. Again, consistency standard and the flow line geometry. And then kind of as a bonus, we tackled the acequias and diversions. These are smaller canals, irrigation canals and ditches. We were able to tackle that to some degree just because they were present in the reference data. So the big takeaway here is we were able, given the experience that we had built up and some of the efficiencies that we had already had built into the system with our knowledge in NHD, we're able to really take the resources that they had available and just tackle so much more work than they were originally going to be able to do just by themselves. So again, another big, huge example of this kind of win-win setup here. In terms of benefits, just in summary, again, one of the bigger items here is being able to have that local knowledge captured and built in, rolled into the NHD. Rules for consistency. So again, the business rules, the decision-making rules were built up, and not only that, but are transferable. They're currently being used to some extent in the arid areas of the California updates that we're currently conducting with California Department of Water Resources. So they don't just apply in Arizona, New Mexico, they apply in other regions as well. So that's a huge benefit. There's a public benefit. Obviously, the updated version of the NHD is now available to public users through the national map and other mediums there. And then, of course, going back to the original Forest Service applications, the fire retardants avoidance maps, hydrographic inventories, so on and so forth. So the NHD has been updated, and now it really helps to support all their research and their work. On the CGST end, this project was, again, it was a little over 2 years, and it was able to help bring on and train up 25 staff and research assistants, which were composed of students, undergraduate students, graduate students, and recent graduates as well. So we had multiple training sessions. We had them on board for the many conference calls that we had. Got many brains to help brainstorm and develop ideas and concepts as we were, getting the project up and running. They acquired skill sets and knowledge in hydrography concepts, GIS, remote sensing. I mean, it offered just a wealth of experience there for all our students, and allowed us to further develop our team and transferable experience. I mentioned our California NHD stewardship work that's going on. A lot of our editors that worked on this project are now working on the California work. They've taken the expertise and the experience they gained from this USFS project and are applying it in the California work that we're now doing. So a really big opportunity to leverage experience and really build a lot of efficiencies here and keeping momentum going. That's a big takeaway here. And of course, with this project, we were able to present the work at various conferences. We presented it at Esri last year. We also had a couple posters at Esri covering the work. So a lot of really exciting opportunities to share information about what we did and how we did it. So I think that covers everything I wanted to go over today. On that note, I'll be happy to take any questions if there are any. I also do want to note we have a technical memorandum available online. I have the URL posted here. If anyone's interested in obtaining a copy of this PowerPoint, I would be more than happy to circulate it, and it has that URL. And that technical memorandum document covers a lot of what I went through today and provides a little bit more detail as well if you're interested in learning. Are there any questions?
Jill, you'll post that in the chat? the link?
Yeah, I can go ahead and do that.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Joel. This was really an interesting, very thorough presentation. So folks, if you have questions, you could type it into the chat, or you can unmute yourself and just ask the question. Whichever way you prefer is fine. I'll start off with a question. Joel, so you talked quite a bit about the provisional names and using local names that weren't official GNIS names. Did you also have a lot of features that maybe had an official GNIS name but weren't correct or weren't applied in the NHD?
To some extent, yes. So we did not look for approved or official names that were not already in the NHD. However, there were many GNIS or officially approved names that were already in the NHD. However, were in there in an incorrect way. So we came across many cases where a name was assigned to a stream, but there was like a gap in continuity, or it was clearly going up the wrong branch of a stream or a river. And in those cases where it was obvious, it was certainly part of our scope to fix those erroneous issues. But again, our scope did not provide time and resources to go looking for names that were approved that are supposed to be in the NHD, but were not in the NHD. It was just limited to those names that were already in the NHD, but may have been assigned incorrectly or in some erroneous way.
I see. So some of those names that you have in that separate file that you had as provisional names, that those might actually be official GNIS names, but you didn't go to that extra step to see if they were.
Exactly. The inclination, though, is that the majority of those are not approved names. We did find cases where, many cases actually, where some names were in the data set, in the reference data sets, but were already in the NHD to begin with. And just based off some of the preliminary assessment work that we were doing when we were scoping out the work, we found that a lot of the names, and as indicated also by forest staff, had not gone through an approval process. And in fact, that's something that we recommended that they consider in the future once they do have resources available, just because it's so important to get those, at the official level and with an ID and then associated and rolled into the NHD.
Yeah, right. I was going to ask about, I presume it would be the Forest Service that would go forward with proposals to the Board of Geographic Names for those names?
We haven't talked about it to any extent, but I'm sure that is something that they would be interested in taking the lead in. And if not, then potentially soliciting some help with that, just because there is a lot of work to do there.
Great. So looking at some of the comments in the chat, Jane Schaefer-Kramer says that they, in California, they're finding GNIS names missing from the NHD and have a couple of staff assigned to fix this on an ongoing basis. And they are also gathering names to submit to the Board of Geographic Names, BGN. Another comment and compliment from Jay Stevens on the presentation. Any other questions folks have? I'll throw one more at you, Joel. How much did you find connectivity issues in the NHD, and how much of it were you fixing? You know, what I mean by that is where you have, particularly in the arid areas like this, you have a lot of streams that stop and don't connect to the rest of the drainage network. Did you see a lot of that? Did you fix that, or what kind of criteria did you use to determine whether it should be fixed or not?
Yeah, we did. We saw a lot in arid areas, as you just indicated, especially drier systems tend to, they have a defined channel and then suddenly they just, fizzle out and they just, disappear and don't have an obvious connection downstream. It can get very tricky. And actually some of the business rules that we developed help to tackle some of that. And we are aware of how important it is to have connectivity between upstream features and have them connected through the network downstream, wherever they may, whatever system downstream they may flow into, through the use of either a stream river feature or a connector, or if it's going through some kind of wash or another type of polygonal feature, an artificial path. So one of the things that we try to do here is be very aware of features that are really seasonal, features that are so dry that are likely to change shape, sometimes even disappear from season to season. And so part of the thresholds that we developed aim to kind of filter out and not include mapping of features that are of that nature, just because they're going to likely pose more issues. And the moment we map them, even though we may be using the latest NAEP, the NAEP may be a year or two old by the time that we're using it, it's likely already, those features are likely already outdated. So we wanted to be really realistic and really focus on the features that are going to be not necessarily more permanent, but more stable, if you will, in the natural environment. And then the features that are going to be the most impactful for the work, something that's going to fizzle out and just dry up, from one season to the other, may not be all that worthwhile to map alongside other features that are more, solid ephemeral flow lines, solid intermittent flow lines, and then some of the other complexes that we saw with like washes and braided streams and stuff like that. So we did take some of that into consideration. And whenever a feature was not connected downstream, but there was an obvious connection, we did work really diligently to make sure that connectivity where it was obvious was connected downstream. Again, through the use of either continuing or extending the stream river, or using connectors, or the artificial path.
Okay. In the business rules that you mentioned, are those in that technical memo that you have there, the link for?
They're not. They're actually a separate document, and we have a California version that's available, and we're actually working on an updated release that should be out in the next month or so. And we can provide that if anybody is interested in taking a look at those.
Okay, yeah, I definitely would be interested in seeing that.
Yeah, I can provide a copy of that. And I think what would be better is, since we're adding new rules to the document and refining some right now, it'd be probably better to hold off until the next release. Again, we have a public version of the last version, but since we're so close to releasing a new one, I think it would be better to hold off on that. But regardless, I can provide a link to further information and a download for that.
Okay, that'd be great.
Jane already has. Just email her.
Yeah, Jane Schaefer-Kramer put that in the comments there, that you can email her for the California one, right?
Yeah. Yeah, again, a lot of the rules that we created for this project were transferred directly into the California, if not all of them, I believe, just because we have a dedicated session for making updates and interpretation within arid regions, and California certainly has a lot of that.
Yeah, there are a couple other questions there in the chat, but we are really right at our time limit. So I want to thank you again, Joel. Maybe if you get a chance I'll leave the meeting chat going here for a minute. If you have a chance to answer those questions that are in the chat, that'd be great. Otherwise, folks, if you have more questions, you can email them either to me and I'll forward them on to Joel, or just go ahead and email them direct to Joel. Thanks again, Joel. This was a fantastic presentation. It's really a great example of stewardship model that seems to be working really well. So appreciate your your time and effort on this, and really appreciate your presenting to us today.
And Joel, could you please drop your email address in the chat real quickly right there at the bottom?
Sure, I'll do that.
That'd be great. Thanks. Okay, well, thanks again, everybody. We will have another one of these calls next month. Let me double check the date. It should be October 20th. October 20th, I think, is the, no, I'm sorry, 27th should be the next one. And watch for calendar invitation for that. We'll see you next month.